This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the prospects for future prosperity? Does the answer depend on whether we're talking about the United States or poorer third world countries? Does the answer depend on whether the prosperity would come about through deliberate planning or through spontaneous market forces? My first guest today is pessimistic that humanitarian action is capable of promoting long-term development in poorer countries, and in many cases, not even effective in providing short-term disaster relief. My second guest is optimistic about the prospects for long-run global prosperity brought about through market forces. My first guest is Dr. Christopher Coyne. Dr. Coyne is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University and the associate director of the FA Hyatt Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center. He's the author of 4 books, including Doing Bad by Doing Good, Why Humanitarian Action Fails, which is the subject of our discussion today. Chris, welcome to Texas Tech and to the show.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here.
So let's start with defining what we're going to talk about today. What is foreign interventionism that you study in this book and in some of your others?
Sure. Well, I try to take a very broad notion of foreign intervention. And the way I think about it is the use of discretionary force or power by one government to intervene in the society of another. And the reason I think this is a good definition is because it allows us to analyze a wide range of interventions. Things from short-term humanitarian relief to longer-term development aid to foreign military intervention to engage in nation-building type activities. And given this broad definition, what I try to do is utilize the tools of economics, mainly focusing on the role of incentives and knowledge constraints to understand the feasibility and limits of these various types of intervention.
And that's of the government actors here in the developed world, the recipients, and also various NGOs?
That's right. And so there's numerous actors involved with this. As you mentioned, there's the intervening governments, which are typically the Western first world governments. There are the countries being occupied or, intervened upon. Those are typically countries that are poorer or that are suffering from humanitarian crises. There's a whole range of international organizations, things like the United Nations, IMF, and so on, as well as non-governmental organizations, private nonprofits, which oftentimes, unfortunately, become linked up and intertwined with government and kind of lose a lot of their desirable properties as non-governmental organizations.
So let's start with kind of the big picture on economic development first. It's not at all unusual to hear politicians or people in NGOs or other just aspirational celebrities say, we're going to do something to end global poverty. We're going to have aid for economic development and we're going to help these poorer countries become rich. What's wrong with that?
Well, there's 2 issues with it. The first one is it misspecifies what economic development is. Economic development is not something that is planned or created. It is something that emerges through the interactions of individuals who are themselves pursuing diverse ends, but also experimenting with new and innovative ways of using scarce resources. And what development ultimately requires is figuring out ways to use scarce resources to produce things people value. None of this information is ex ante given. That is, it doesn't exist outside of people discovering it. Moreover, this information cannot be obtained by a single person or a small group of people, even if they call themselves development experts, even if they're the smartest people, who have the best educations. There's no way to obtain this information, and unfortunately, people found this out good and hard during efforts to centrally plan economic activity under communism and socialism. And so development requires discovery, which requires economic freedom because individuals need to have freedom in order to experiment, try different things, and interact with other people.
But what about just basic development projects that they're doing in the name of long-term development? If they go in and they build hospitals or build roads, infrastructure, this doesn't help with economic development?
Well, you might think it does, but it's far from clear that it contributes to development. And the reason why, of course, is simply producing outputs, making stuff, doesn't contribute to development. It only contributes to development if it is value added. That is, if people use the hospitals, if they have all of the complementary equipment, the skilled nurses and doctors and technology. Roads only matter if they actually connect people that can engage in trade and if you have all the complementary transportation that's required to utilize them, and so on. The issue, of course, is that planners who are typically outside of a country coming into a society oftentimes lack the local knowledge of how to allocate those scarce resources to produce things that generate outcomes that people actually value. And so a lot of development projects simply produce these grandiose white elephants, these outputs that people oftentimes praise themselves for, but actually contribute very little value on the ground.
So historically, when we look at these, is there an association between development aid going in and development in terms of GDP growth or something happening?
Well, there's mixed empirical evidence on this. And so some studies find slight growth, other studies find zero growth, and still others find negative growth. And so the empirical evidence, and part of it's so hard to measure these things. One of the main issues which should raise skepticism immediately is that for a long period of time, governments didn't even record the type of aid they were giving, the amount, and the flows. On top of that, of course, different aid agencies, so across countries, record aid differently. And so utilizing aggregate measures are very limited. On top of that, what we have to end up using is economic theory to figure out what aid can and can't do. And what it can do is increase certain predetermined outputs. It can build a hospital that some bureaucrat decides to build. It can pave a road. But what it can't do is create development, because no one knows how to create development, which is precisely why markets are so important.
So I think you're at an important point here that the knowledge problem is just insurmountable to plan development, but they can create outputs. So what about simpler humanitarian aid then that's not caring about long-term development, but it's Haiti has an earthquake or a hurricane. We're just going to give them emergency stuff.
Sure, and in principle that can work. And to the extent that aid has been successful historically, it is typically focused on short-term, technologically feasible options, such as providing vaccines to people. This can be done. But the thing to keep in mind is simply increasing certain outputs does not necessarily lead to success. Oftentimes the aid gets stolen. There's an incentive for the people that are in power, who are often corrupt, to rechannel it to their friends and cronies and so on.
So what about like a staple one that seems so uncontroversial, food for peace?
Sure. So the Food for Peace program's a program that was passed in the 50s under President Eisenhower. And it's a very basic idea, which is a transfer of basic food items to poor people. The catch with this, and why it's so interesting for this discussion, is that what has happened over time is the aid has become tied. And so these aid transfers require the money to be spent on food produced by U.S. farmers and then shipped to those in need on U.S. registered ships. The problem with this, of course, is that it takes a significantly long period of time to transport these food items from the U.S. to those in need. And sadly, the main industry in these poor countries tends to be agriculture. And so oftentimes food is relatively close by, but the supposedly well-intentioned bureaucrats have set up this program that really lines the pockets of farmers and merchant marine operators at the expense of people that are suffering.
And I suspect that that's precisely why this is tied.
That's exactly, well, the idea behind it being tied is that it ensures that the people get nutritious food. This is the rhetoric that's used, at least, and that it arrives to those who actually need it. The reality is it's tied to provide corporate welfare to certain targeted individuals.
So if something as simple as this has those problematic issues with incentives, this makes me very pessimistic even going into this question then. What about the other type of foreign intervention, of where we see a bad leader in power, we use the military to get rid of them and try to give them something better?
Right. Now this is an important point, and the reason why is oftentimes people think about these things separately, humanitarian aid and military aid. But the reality is they're all linked together. Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on, there's a humanitarian effort, a development effort, and a military effort all intertwined together. And here's the thing. Nation-building efforts, as the very name implies, suggests that well-intentioned experts can go into a different society and literally build it from the ground up. Economic institutions, social institutions, political and legal institutions, and so on. And this is patently absurd. The idea that a group of people outside of a society somehow can design institutions and impose them upon people and create a free society that's wealthy and prosperous just doesn't make sense, and the empirical evidence does not support it. Yet it is tried again and again by those who are in the U.S. government.
So just for example, in the last couple of minutes here, a little bit about one of the efforts recently in Afghanistan where bad people were clearly in power and what's going on now? What have been the problems or successes?
Sure. Well, Afghanistan's a perfect kind of microcosm of all these issues. Of course, the issues in Afghanistan prior to 9/11 started when the U.S. intervened to indirectly through Pakistan to combat the Soviet occupation in the late 70s during the Soviet-Afghan War. As part of that, the U.S. government armed what at the time were called freedom fighters. Today we call them the Taliban. Because, of course, after the Soviets were forced out, there was a power vacuum and they took over, using, among other things, the equipment and arms that the U.S. government had supplied to them. After the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. intervenes, overthrows the government, but then engages in a very arrogant and hubristic effort to rebuild a national set of institutions, which has failed significantly. And to provide just one kind of example, Afghanistan is the hub of opium production in the world. And the U.S. government has spent approximately $8.5 billion over the last 15 years, and opium production has gone up. And so the return on investment is horrible. It's not just negative, it's actually terrible. It's empowered the Taliban and achieved absolutely nothing. And so it makes sense when you think about these knowledge issues and the perverse incentives and extend it beyond very simple aid issues to literally rebuilding entire societies. And so my position on this is that the U.S. needs a much humbler foreign policy and one that recognizes and appreciates these constraints.
All right, well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
If you're like me, you're probably ready for a dose of optimism by now. Stick around, because my next guest is going to give us rational reasons to be optimistic.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Matt Ridley. Dr. Ridley is a member of the House of Lords and writes a regular column in the Times and the Wall Street Journal. He's the author of books that have sold more than 2 million copies worldwide. One of these books, The Rational Optimist, How Prosperity Evolves, is the topic for our show today. Matt, welcome to Texas Tech and to the TV show.
Thank you. It's great to be on the show.
We're thrilled to have you here. And let's start by going back thousands of years to pre-Homo sapiens, where there's 45,000 generations of these people, or these pre-Homo sapiens, with very little change.
Yes.
From one generation to the next. What starts getting us change?
So people like Homo erectus lived for millions of years and had technology. They had beautiful stone tools, but very little innovation. You see very little change in their tools over tens of thousands of generations. That's a weird concept to us. Innovation and technology kind of go together today. But then sometime around 200,000 to 100,000 years ago, particularly in Africa to start with, something changes. And what you see is a continual changing in the technology, and you get an expansion of people around the world. People spill out of Africa and go all the way to Australia, and they go all the way to Europe, and eventually they get into the Americas. And then you get new technologies. You get new kinds of hunting, you get bows and arrows, and then you get farming, and then you get the Industrial Revolution, and the whole thing kind of gathers pace. Now, what triggers that? What kicks it off? And my argument is that it's all about exchange. That if you contrast what's happening in those early Homo sapiens with the creatures that were there before, is that they're exchanging goods. They're starting to make objects move long distances through trade, and as a result they're starting to get objects from a long way away, but also ideas from a long way away, and they're able to put ideas together and start producing new ideas, and that the whole business of exchange and specialization, the division of labor, which is the source of all human prosperity, kind of gradually builds from there.
And it builds first within hunter-gatherer tribes, and then the expansion continues. And this has implications then for how much knowledge can be utilized?
Well, exactly. It's surprising. I mean, we think of trade, as being quite a recent thing, but actually it's 10 times as old as agriculture. There's trade among hunter-gatherers all around Australia, and et cetera, long before there's any farming. And places that get isolated, like Tasmania, which became isolated, go backwards. They actually give up technologies. Their technological base shrinks because they haven't got the contacts to maintain the specialization and exchange network. And what that does, of course, is it enables you to suddenly do more than you're capable of understanding. You can start to have objects which You know how to make part of it, I know how to make part of it, but none of us knows how to make the whole thing. And when you think about it, that's true of pretty well everything in our pockets that we're wearing today.
This TV show that we're sitting at that you and I know how to make none of other than sit here and have a conversation.
And indeed, nobody knows. That's the beauty. I mean, that wonderful Leonard Read essay, I Pencil, in which he points out that a pencil is made by millions of people contributing all around the world. Not one of them knows how to make a pencil.
So here's a puzzle I have for you then. If we switch from no innovation for so long to now an innovative and trading people, they might be innovative in trading, but in terms of prosperity, human prosperity doesn't change much for thousands of years until we get to the Industrial Revolution. It's the other hockey stick of economic development. Why is that?
Well, I think what tends to happen in early human history is that prosperity shows up in number of babies, as it were, rather than in anything else. So for a long time, the most prosperous tribe is the one that produces most offspring, and therefore is most successful in war and defeats its neighbors and things like that. And particularly once you get early agriculture, you get a huge increase in the population. I mean, many times more people in agricultural societies than there were in hunter-gatherer societies, but they're not better off because there's so many more of them. So you're kind of running to stay in the same place. That's what you might call the Malthusian Trap. Malthus said, the population expands till everybody starves. And that kind of does happen in agricultural societies. But along comes the Industrial Revolution, sometime starting 200 years ago or so, and suddenly you're harnessing more energy, literally energy, in terms of being able to amplify your work by making more, and you're trading on a much faster scale. And then you get this very gradual pickup in human living standards. And then suddenly, in the 20th century, it takes off, in the second half of the 20th century in particular. And in my lifetime, the average income of the average person on the planet has trebled in real terms, even while the population has doubled. That's quite extraordinary and unprecedented in human history. I mean, we forget how recent this is. As long as 2 generations ago, you weren't seeing anything like these kind of improvements in human living standards.
So really this harnessing of energy it was a big deal because it's actually releasing calories basic for production and coming from a different way. That changes this trajectory of economic development then.
Yeah, the way I like to put it is in a medieval farming system, if you scattered seed on the ground and hoped to grow more seed, you had a good year if you got 4 seeds for every seed you put out there. And a bad year was 3, and you had to keep one of them back for the next year, so you've only got 2 left. You're pretty marginal here. Today, with a wheat crop, it's something like 80 seeds that you get back for every seed you do. Now, one of the reasons for that huge increase in productivity, is partly you've improved the genetics of the crop, but partly you're using pesticides, you're using chemical fertilizers, you're using tractors and fuel and things like that, everything to help that plant do twice as well or 10 times as well as it used to do. And so the energy amplifies the work. One man driving a tractor can cultivate as much land as 500 men could do in a day in the past.
So this is certainly true of humans overall and the prosperity that's come in the last couple hundred years. But what about in the first half of the show, we talked about less developed parts of the world and kind of the pessimism of being able to get development there. But you're optimistic about Africa's future. Tell me about that.
I'm very optimistic about Africa's future. Africa is following the trajectory that Asia followed a generation ago and that Europe followed 150 years ago. And the way you see this happening is that Africa, take global poverty, for example. When I was born, 60-70% of the world lived on less than $2 a day. Now that number is below 10%. That's an incredible change. Now, most of those 10% are in Africa. Africa is the continent that got most left behind, and it had a particularly bad time in the 80s and 90s with the AIDS epidemic and malaria and so on. But it is now experiencing very rapid rates of growth, very sharp declines in fertility in the number of children per woman, and very big increases in trade. It's beginning to get the kind of infrastructure you need, the kind of energy you need as well. I mean, it's vital to have the energy to amplify people's work. that means it will take off. When countries do catch-up growth, like Asia has been doing in recent years, they can grow very fast for quite a long time. And there are countries in Africa like Botswana that are roaring ahead, countries like Ghana, countries like Ethiopia that are doing extremely well now, and that almost can no longer be considered extremely poor countries. They're almost middle-income countries.
Right, is the farther you get left behind, the quicker your catch-up can be, because the world has so much more technology and capital to flow to it. So your argument is trade, not aid, that is getting development underway in Africa and has the future for them there.
Yes, I mean, I think, some aid is a good idea. When there's a disaster, you want to be able to help. But what dragged Asia out of poverty was trade, not aid. The same for Europe in times in the past. Trade is the best thing we can offer poor countries because it's lasting. It actually leaves behind an imprint that stays. Dismantling the barriers to trade between Africa and Europe, between Africa and other parts of the world, is the best possible thing we can do.
And there's also starting to be some evidence of what some people have called contagious capitalism, of when freer countries trade with less free countries, those less free ones even start to improve their institutions over time.
Yes, I think that's right. I think you people look across and say, hang on, I'd like a little bit of that. Take Mauritius, for example. It's a small country, and 50 years ago you say, my God, it's totally dependent on the sugarcane industry. It's extremely poor. It's miles from anywhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean. How's it ever going to get its act together? It's now an extremely successful country on the lines of Hong Kong, really, basically a sort of independent trading state in the middle, just completely open to the rest of the world. Sugar is a tiny proportion of its income. So the small independent trading states with connectivity in the world can do great things. Container shipping has been enormously important to the world, but so has the internet and other high-tech things. The connectivity of the world is what makes it prosperous, and that connectivity just took a quantum leap in the last generation.
So that's probably a good place to go to wrap up our interview here, is the connectivity and what you see going forward in your optimism for the future, not just of Africa, but the planet overall, the humans on the planet overall, when I see so much pessimism around us.
Yeah, my favorite quote is from Thomas Babington Macaulay, a historian, who complained about pessimists. He said, on what grounds is everyone so pessimistic, when actually I think we're going to see great improvements. Everybody thinks it's about to get worse. He was writing in 1830 about Britain, which at that point had hardly started to take off in the Industrial Revolution and was about to get much, much richer. So he was fed up with the pessimists even then. So I think we're overdoing the pessimism today. Now, there are things that I'm pessimistic about today. There's too much bureaucracy, there's too much superstition, there's too many people wanting to head down the route of violence and so on. It's not going to be an all smooth sailing. Nonetheless, I think there's every reason to think that this planet is going to be populated by the end of this century with much wealthier countries, much happier people, and much better environment too.
And is that because as we get more people who are connected, we have better ideas?
It's all about connectivity, in my view. Human society is a collective brain, a distributed brain, a sort of, it's among the knowledge of how to run society is distributed between our brains, not within our brains. That's one of my favorite arguments. If we stay connected, then we can't even stop this process, even if we wanted to. I mean, you can't switch off the internet now. I mean, you hit the Earth with an asteroid, you could do a lot of damage, but I suspect it would be very hard to undo civilization completely.
Well, that's an optimistic note for us to end on. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
The theme of today's episode was pessimism and optimism. And at first, it might seem that one of my guests was pessimistic and the other optimistic, but if you think about it, I think there's actually a lot in common between the two of them. My first guess is pessimistic that you can promote development in poorer parts of the world by using top-down planning through foreign aid. And it's a problem of the knowledge and the incentives of those trying to plan for others to force development where it's not. But yet the optimism on the second part of our show was all about the spontaneous forces of humans interacting on an individual basis and sharing their collective intelligence to build a higher standard of living. That solves the type of knowledge problem that my first guest was pessimistic the planners could do for us. The more we do as humans to spontaneously solve these problems by interacting through trade, the more development can occur and the less aid would be needed in the first place. I think that's an optimistic vision for the future going forward. See you next time.